Welcome to It Happened in Grand Prairie as we bring you our history tape number 77. This is September the 19th, 1988, and we are very privileged today to have an illustrious lady, the First Lady of the Grand Prairie ISD for many years, in that her husband was the superintendent of schools. And we are so happy to have with us today Mrs. H. Chambers, our very good friend Mildred. Mildred, welcome to It Happened in Grand Prairie.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. Now, Mildred Chambers, you have a long tenure in our city, and we're just so delighted that you and Mr. Chambers are still residents of our city, and we are very sad that he couldn't be with us today because of his failing health, but we are glad he sent you as his good ambassador, and we know that you're going to tell us some exciting things about Mr. H. Chambers and Mildred Chambers when they came to Grand Prairie. But before we get to the Grand Prairie portion, we'd like for you to look out into your camera right straight ahead and tell us about Mildred Chambers, the genealogy, the names of your mother and father, and anything you'd like to tell about them if they migrated from other states to the Texas area. Set the stage for us in a sort of a little genealogy review about you, and then we're going to ask you to do the same thing for Mr. Chambers. But first, let's get your history.
I was born in Weatherford, Texas. My father's family having moved there in 1879 from Corsicana. My grandfather had been in the Civil War and returned to East Texas in 1865. My father was born in East Texas in that year, and my grandfather moved to Corsicana where he had relatives and became the first mayor of Corsicana during Reconstruction. There were real estate opportunities farther west, and they moved to Weatherford in 1879. My father died in 1956.
All right, would you give us his full name, the full name of your father then?
My father was Wright Dudley Taylor, and he was in business there. He went to the Masonic Institute in Weatherford and went to A&M College in 1888, I believe it was, when there was just one building at College Station, the dormitory and the classrooms and all. He regretted very much. He was quite a student and very ambitious to learn. But his father, by that time, had 9 children, including himself, some older, and so he came home to help his father in a real estate and mortgage business, which they continued to run, plus abstract business and insurance. And continued in the building on the corner of the square for many, many years. My father retired semi-retired in approximately 10 years before his death, but he was still writing family insurance when he broke his hip and was still in remarkably good health at 90 years old.
Wonderful. Now, all right, now we have your father in Weatherford. Now tell us about your mother and possibly how he met her, and was it in Weatherford or Corsicana, or bring us up to date on your mother and give us her full name, including the maiden name.
My mother was Kitty Noland. Catherine Noland was born in Nashville, Tennessee. She finished high school at 18 and came to Weatherford in the fall of 88 or 9 to visit a great aunt who had reared her mother and was more like her grandmother to her. She came out to spend a year with her. Well, she met friends and liked it. And 3 years later was married to my father, who had been living there and was in business at the time. They had a very happy life. They built a home. I ran across check stubs a few days ago of the house, first house they built 2 years after they married, not quite 2 years. And that house is still standing. I have pictures of it. That's where I was born and where we lived until 1919. And then built a home in the west part of town where my mother died in 1960. She was born in Nashville, and her father had stayed in Tennessee. He was born in Virginia, Robert Callender Nolan, and was in the Civil War in the Middle States and stayed there after the war because his mother had died, and they married in 1868. And
go ahead.
He died in 1911 and is buried in Confederate Circle in Nashville, Tennessee. She came to Texas to live with her daughter 2 years later, and until she died in 1922.
That sounds like a wonderful beginning for your parents in Weatherford, Texas. And I noticed you mentioned that that was where you were born. Do you have any brothers and sisters, Mildred? And if you do, I'd like for you to name those for our record.
My sister was older. She was Mary Barber Taylor. Barber was a family name, it was my grandmother's name. And she married Ralph Alexander, also from Weatherford, and they live in Houston now. My brother is 2 years younger than I. He, all three of us and all four of the grandchildren have finished the university. And my brother went on to Harvard Business School and has been in the brokerage and feed mill business in Marshall. He married a Marshall girl when he met her through her father, when he was doing service as a broker for him, and has continued to live. He worked in New York in the first year of the Depression at $150 a month, and my father had to support that salary for him to stay there. But he was with Chase Bank, and they sent him to Dallas, which pleased him very much. He didn't like New York, and he likes Marshall better than Dallas. His wife died in 1974, and he's continued to live in this great big house by himself, but makes a life for himself very, very well.
Now, Mildred, we have a pretty good smattering of your family history, and we have 3 children born to your parents, where we're leaving you in Weatherford. And we're going to leave you there temporarily, but let's have a little bit of history of Mr. H. Chambers, give his parents' name, and give us a little genealogy about him and his era.
Well, I never met his father. His father and mother were divorced when he was about 5 years old. He was C.L. Chambers, and his mother was a native of Erath County, and he was born at his grandmother's home in Erath County. His mother, in 1908, when he was 7 years old, remarried a man who later became a Methodist minister. He was farmed for a good many years, and then went into the Methodist ministry and retired at Clifton. They lived at Clifton until each of them died, and they're buried in Clifton.
And their names?
James William Colwell, and her name was Amzona Wesnant Colwell.
That is wonderful. All right. Did Mr. Chambers have any brothers or sisters?
there were 4 half-brothers
All right.
who have been very attentive, and my husband always felt like his mother encouraged all the boys by boarding whatever rural teacher was coming into the neighborhood to give them inspiration and help. And he finished high school at Cisco to get through an accredited high school. And at 18, struck out on his own financially and physically, and got through 3 years of college on his own, and sang with a Methodist evangelist in the summertime to make money to go to school the next year. But he dropped out then and taught 2 years before he went to Southwestern and finished his degree. And then he took his master's degree at Texas and helped each of the brothers as they came along, and they wound up with 1 PhD, 2 masters, and a bachelor's, and very outstanding people.
All right, now we've gotten Mr. Chambers born and educated, and now how did the two of you meet? Mr. and Mrs. Chambers, how did you all find one another, in Weatherford or where?
It was, and I went first after I got my graduate degree, I went to Hillsborough Junior College and taught English 1 year. And the Weatherford College people were friends of the family, and the faculty was short, and they asked me to come back. I'd been away from home for 6 years, so I decided to go to Weatherford College, where I taught math and French. And he went there as dean the same year, followed Mr. Ben Wiseman, who came to high school at Highland Park as principal that year. And he was dean there 4 years, and then superintendent in the Weatherford schools another 6 years before we moved to Greenville. But we met at Weatherford College and were there together. Married the 2nd year we were there.
Would you like to give us the marriage date so that we would have that in our record?
We were married December 21st, 1929. So that will make 59 years in December.
Yes, it will. You and Mr. Chambers are celebrating some good ones together. All right, now, we have you married and living in Weatherford. Do you have a family? Do you have boys and girls?
Yes, I have.
Would you like to name them, please?
My daughter is Catherine. Was married to Ross Cox, who was a pilot for Braniff Airways, and they moved to California for him to fly the military to the Far East, and liked it so well they never did come back. She still lives in California, though he died in 1984. She comes back frequently to visit. And
do they have children?
They have 2 lovely girls. Who
Would you name them?
Well, her name's Laura Catherine Cox and Carol Cox. And Laura finished the University of California at Berkeley 4 years ago and is working for KGO radio station in San Francisco as a promotions manager. And Carol finished Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo a year ago in December, and is just finishing 6 months student visa, work visa they call it, in London. They're allowed to stay only 6 months on this visa, but they work and they're allowed to take tours where they want to go. She's been to Russia and to Greece and to Vienna twice, and to all the places. I had a card from her today. She said she and her roommate spent Sunday on the Isle of Wight, and it was very interesting.
Do you have another daughter or son?
I have a son who's an attorney in Dallas. And
would you give us his name?
Well, he's Dudley, Hilliard Dudley Chambers. The Dudley was a family name way back, and my father was very proud of carrying it on. His grandmother was Harriet Dudley. And Dudley Chambers went with the law firm of Jackson Walker in Dallas 27 years ago, and has been with them, of course, ever since.
Do you have any other children?
Done quite well. And he has a daughter who finished SMU 2 years ago, and
her name?
What is it? Christine Chambers. And she majored in advertising and is working for an advertising firm in Dallas that creates televised ads, and has been very happy in that. And
all right. Do you have any other children other than the two you've mentioned?
Oh, no, those are the only two.
The only two that you
They were
have.
both born in Weatherford before we left Weatherford, and we lived in Greenville 10 years, and my daughter graduated from high school in Greenville. Both of them went to the university. He 6.5 years, and she was there 4. So,
what brought you and Mr. H. Chambers to Grand Prairie, Texas, and when?
Well, possibly the contact was a combination of Mr. Roberts' friendship, L.A. Roberts, and the fact that Bud Hardman went to Weatherford College while Hilliard was dean over there, and of course he was a big athlete, and Bud had kept up some, and so Bud was president of the board when they were looking for our superintendent to succeed Mr. Roberts, and contacted him. We had come to Dallas, and he had gone into the school jewelry and engraving business with a friend, and it wasn't working out too well, and this looked like a good chance to get back in the school administration.
What year did he come to Grand Prairie, Texas?
Well, he actually came out here some in the fall of 1950.
All right.
But took over. We built a house here during the fall of 1950 and moved into it in January of 1951.
All right, and when he became superintendent here, what did Mildred do?
Well, I hadn't really worked since we left Weatherford because he never did want me in his schools. He never did think it was a good idea. And so I kept house and reared the children, and when we came to Grand Prairie, my parents were aging 50 miles away, and I, of course, did a good deal of looking after them. They continued in their home until each of them died, and so I was able to see that they could do that. And it's been, there was lots to do. Grand Prairie had 15,000 people, and the schools were on half-time because LTV had burgeoned so, wasn't LTV then.
North American Aviation?
And had so many students and so little tax base And of course, they did get aid for defense plants impacted students, districts. And so with help, they were able to pull out of the mire and do what needed to be done. And he was superintendent 18 years, and of course the town and the school, all of it, so lots of progress in that time.
You have a wonderful tribute paid to Mr. H.H. Chambers, and if we'll hold that up, maybe our camera can pick this up. This has a real good picture of the professor, as we call him here, and it says, "Hundreds pay tribute to the retiring schoolman." I know that it was hard for him to want to retire, but those things have to come down the pike. He was a splendid, splendid educator and at the helm many long years. And you brought another piece of memorabilia that we're going to have to show and tell, Mildred. Would you like to say something about this one before we put it down?
It was, of course, a very high point and a very beautifully appointed affair. Dr. Edgar came up from Austin, and
he's the head honcho of Texas in education, Texas Education Agency.
He was head of the agency at the time, and helped dedicate the auditorium, which has always been a very. When the auditorium was built, the board offered to name it for him, and he said, "Well, just wait till I retire, and if you still want to do that, why, that'll be all right." So they did.
And so the board did dedicate the auditorium at Grand Prairie High School, and that's the reason when we have concerts and wonderful things, we always say, well, we're going to the H.H. Chambers Auditorium for this concert. And isn't that wonderful?
Well, he's very proud of that.
All right. This does show, I believe, one of his boards. You brought up that, and maybe we can pick that up without getting a glare of the Board of Education.
This was the 1965 board. It was the one I could put my hand on. Of course, the auditorium was built in 1963, but practically the same composition of the board was on in 2 years previously.
And if I can read this, this is Mr. Chambers, this is Mr. Brown, this is, no, let's see, that's Benton Ford. That looks like Benton Ford, isn't it? Can you help me there a little bit?
Yeah, that's Benton Ford.
Benton Ford.
Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, whom I'm married to. Dr. Collop.
Ralph Clark.
Ralph Clark, who we lost to death last week. There's Mr. Brown.
Yes. J.O. Wilson.
Dr. John O. Wilson and Mr. J.P. Etterholt.
Yes.
Yes, that was an illustrious board, wasn't it?
Well, you work on a school board and wind up with good friends. You're doing quite well, I think. He always told them that if they didn't think he could do the job, why they should get somebody they thought could.
All right. Now, other than being superintendent, y'all were very important in the community. I know that Mr. Chambers was very involved in Rotary, but tell us about your First Methodist Church affiliation. I know that you all have attended the First Methodist Church, and tell us about something about what you've done in your clubs and organizations.
Well, actually, he did less in the church here than he had done in any church we'd ever been in, because he was out of town so much. He simply didn't getting money in Washington and trying to tend to things that would further school progress, that he really didn't have time to take on big responsibilities like Crusade for Christ and things like that, which he had done in other schools. He had always sung in the choir, but he was too undependable for that here. So while he was on the Board of Stewards most of the time, he was never the leader that he might have been or that he had been in the church. And by the time we were well enough known and could do very much, my father died in 1956, and I was the only one of the three who could get over there to attend things, and we had to keep a housekeeper and a nurse with my mother. And so I was over there at least one day and night a week and had responsibilities about that. And
Well, tell us about his involvement in Rotary. I know he's been a member of Rotary forever, nearly.
yes, he was a Rotarian in Weatherford for 10 years. And then when he moved to Greenville, the president of the Rotary Club had lost his father that week or something. Anyway, the Lions got to him first, but he's been a Rotarian here. He was president of the club the year the International met in Dallas, and worked a lot on that, and committees of the women that I was on. Not that we had any great responsibility or contribution, but it was nice to be involved. We entertained out of the country
Yes.
delegates, and I continued to correspond with these Australians that I started corresponding with during that time.
Ms.
And
Chambers, we have 2 more minutes left, and before we do, you have one piece of jewelry in your hand that is an archive. We could not get off of this show without your showing and telling that beautiful piece of jewelry and from whence it came.
Well, Ms. Jackson urged me to bring something, and I thought of this as maybe something I could wear. It was a necklace in my grandmother's trousseau when she married in 1868 in Tennessee. And I've worn it with a great deal of pride. It's right in with the jewelry of today. And I've always enjoyed wearing it. There's always something that it looks nice on.
Ms. Chambers, what was your favorite club or organization that you personally belong to? And we just have 1 more minute to tell this, so if you would just name possibly your most favorite group that you meet with.
Well, I hate to say that it was not a Grand Prairie organization at the time. I went into the National Society of Colonial Dames some 58 years ago. My mother had been one, and she put me in that. After my mother died and I had time, I served on that board as a state registrar for 6 years and made many lovely friends and learned a great deal about genealogy, and took a lot of interest myself. My mother had 3 little children and a husband who worked at night at the office a good deal.
Well, we want to thank you for all of the memories that you've brought back to us.
Well, it's been a pleasure to
Mildred,
me.
it was wonderful. We could have talked with you for hours, and we know, but we want to thank you for the salute to both you and Mr. H.H. Chambers, our very good friend.
Thank you.
And this is Ruthie Jackson reminding you that history is as we live and do.
Ooh, there it
beautiful.
is.